Welcome on into the Utah Blockcast. I'm Steve Bartle, Utah Insider for KSL Sports. Uh, Appreciate all the Utah fans tuning in, and whether on YouTube or on your podcast platforms, appreciate all the support and appreciate all you listeners out there. So, on this episode, I want to talk about who or what are the big X factors for Utah this upcoming season. I've put together a list of 7 things that I think will mostly determine Utah's success this season, obviously at varying degrees, but I think this is, for the most part, what will be sort of the X factors for Utah. So let's dive into it. Don't want to waste too much time, and let's just get right to it. For me, I think when it comes to X factors, I think they can come in different forms. They can be high level performers that just can overwhelm sometimes when they play up to their ceiling. They can be unknown commodities that surprise, that step up and emerge over the course of a season. Um, they can be other dynamics as well. So I think there's a number of different ways to look at who or what is an X factor. But for me, this conversation starts with quarterback Devin Dampier. I think for me, Devin Dampier is, he's fantastic. Obviously, after hiring Jason Beck, Devin Dampier was the obvious choice in the transfer portal and who Utah went to, and it just made so much sense in regards to bringing in the quarterback that executed the offense under Beck, and having that command of the offense. It was really clear to see the difference between Dampier and the other quarterbacks in terms of their command of the offense and how well they executed. Dampier looked really comfortable. He looked confident, and it was a clear difference between the other quarterbacks. So, obviously Utah fans are very familiar now with the numbers that are pretty exciting when it comes to Dampier. 2,768 passing yards, 12 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, 1,166 rushing yards, and 19 touchdowns on the ground. It'll be interesting to kind of see what sort of numbers he puts up this year. I don't think he's going to be as relied upon in on the ground game. I don't think 19 touchdowns on the ground is going to be in the cards for Dampier this season. That's not to say, but that's mostly because I believe others are going to be more involved. I think Wayshawn Parker is going to eat into that touchdown number, and I think that's a good thing. I think for Dampier, I think double-digit touchdowns on the ground is still very doable as he makes this transition to Utah. But I think what you're hoping to see from him in terms of numbers and projections, you want to see that 2,700 passing yards. I think that's a great goal. You'd love to see, his touchdown to interception ratio, increase maybe by 50%, where he's throwing 18 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. That should be a worthwhile goal. And then, on the ground, you're looking for him to be just a dynamic presence, right? Averaging 6, 7 yards a pop, minimizing the losses and that sort of thing. If he can run for 4 digits again this year, that's really exciting. So when looking at what Dampier brings as a passer, I think there's a lot of reason to be pretty optimistic about what he can be. When going back to last year, in comparison to some of the other quarterbacks in the Big 12, you look at Pro Football Focus and how they graded things and how they rated some of the quarterbacks. I've got the Big 12 quarterbacks, all of them here with Dampier included, and obviously there's going to be a difference in terms of the Big 12 competition, Mountain West competition, and all that. But I think there's some really important things to note here. So obviously the 89.9 grade, offensive grade, would have been second best in the Big 12 behind only Shedeur Sanders. And that again speaks to just how dynamic he was on the ground. But I think where I get really excited is this number here, this big time throws, right? So what is a big time throw? Let's go here. Pro Football Focus. This is the definition right here. Big time throw, a pass with excellent ball location and timing, generally thrown further down the field and or into a tighter window. And then another thing, the TWP, turnover worthy plays. A pass that has a higher percentage chance to be intercepted, or a poor job of taking care of the ball and fumbling. So essentially, how much um, are you minimizing bad throws, turnover worthy throws where you're throwing it into to coverage, where a defender has an opportunity to take the ball away? How secure are you with the ball in your hands? And so here you see, Dampier accounted for 20 big time throws, which would have been, tied for fourth best in the league with Morton at Texas Tech, Rocco Beck, Jalen Daniels, Shedeur Sanders. Those were the only three ahead of Dampier in terms of the total number. And when you look at the passing attempts, you kind of like what you see there, where Shedeur is throwing for 90 more. He attempted 90 more passes. Beck, 70 more passes. So you like that rate there. And then you see here Isaac Wilson down here, 7 big time throws, and we remember some of them. The pass to Money Parks against TCU, that would have qualified as a big time throw. So obviously a big difference here between Dampier and Wilson. Turnover worthy plays. This is where Kyle Whittingham is just going to love this, because you're minimizing your turnover worthy plays. He kept that to 10, which is really impressive. In terms of the rate of turnover worthy plays, he would have been third best behind Sam Levitt and Shedeur Sanders. And considering what those two quarterbacks did at Colorado and Arizona State, I think that's the sort of company you want to keep. And I think where Utah fans should feel really excited is Dampier throwing deep, right? There's a lot of questions about his accuracy and what he can do. And, I'm going to talk more about Jason Beck and the offense. But, when you look at what Dampier was able to do in New Mexico, obviously with some of the limited talent around him, 19 of his 20 big time throws came at least 20 yards down the field. So he would have had the third most big time throws here, minimizing his turnover worthy plays to 4, which, is right in the middle of the Big 12, but still top 3 in the Big 12. And you like that grade, 82.8. You'd like to see it be a little bit better, but still, that's pretty solid, considering, where Utah was down here 14th at a 51.3 grade, only 7 big time throws to 9 turnover worthy plays with Isaac Wilson at the helm. And obviously, this is going to paint a bad picture of Isaac Wilson, but I think, we understand what Isaac went through last year. He was put into a position that he probably wasn't fully prepared for. And as a freshman, there's going to be a lot of growing pains. So, I think just this is reason to be optimistic about what Dampier can bring the offense. But two, what I really like is the 71 attempts down the field. There's been so much talk about this offense, being a run heavy offense. But again, this speaks to, how often Beck and Dampier are going to look to push the ball down the field, to take those shots, to take advantage of defenses, trying to take the run away. And so I think this is a really exciting number, 71 attempts. Obviously, you want to see some of these numbers improve, but I think just having that, potentially having better pass catchers, particularly more effective ones deep down the field, in a Tobias Merriweather, in a Larry Simmons. I think that's there's reason to be optimistic about what Dampier can do there for Utah. So for me, I think Devin Dampier is the single biggest offensive X factor. I think he's obviously pretty dynamic and has plenty of room to grow as a quarterback. So for me, Devin Dampier is the biggest offensive X factor. Number 2 for me, the offensive line playing up to their ceiling. This one is going to be key for Utah to for them to reach their maximum potential this season. The offensive line has to play up to their ceiling, because Utah's offensive line, it's the best unit on the team. It's one of the best units, regardless of position, in the Big 12, and it's in the conversation 4 best offensive lines in the country. The thing there is they haven't earned that designation yet, but they're in the conversation. There's a lot of people that believe they're capable of becoming one of the best offensive lines in the country. So, that to me is why the O line playing up to their ceiling is the second biggest offensive X factor for Utah. Obviously, with two potential first round draft prospects in Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu leading the way, Jim Harding has two of the most promising tackles in the country. And when you have that, you have a pretty good chance of having a pretty good offensive line. And then, those two combined to give up just 3 sacks and 951 combined pass block snaps. And, obviously you want to see some of the pressure numbers improve. And I think part of that too was, the quarterback, Isaac Wilson, not getting the ball out in a timely manner. And I think that'll be a thing that Dampier can help a lot with, and is getting the ball out in a timely manner. But also, escaping some of those pressures and avoiding some of them altogether, where that can eliminate some of those pressures as well. So I think, the key for Caleb Lomu is taking a big step forward like Spencer did this past season as a run blocker. And if he can do that, that puts Utah in really, really good shape. This group has, one of the top graded guards according to PFF and to Noah Togiai, and then two other veterans in Jaron Kump and Michael Mokofisi, who have played just a lot of football together. To have this group back, having played together all last year, and then have the depth behind them is really, really encouraging and should be really exciting for Utah fans. So I think Utah fans should feel, pretty confident in this offensive line and their potential. And I think a key that will get some talk probably, but probably not the amount of talk that it deserves. But I think the presence of Isaac Asiata is going to have a really good impact, a really positive impact on the offensive line. When he was here the last go around, I think in 2023, Spencer Fano's freshman year, I think, there was a lot of optimism that he was a really good coach. And I think he has a way of connecting with the offensive line, having played the position so recently, that he can communicate with them. He can basically be a second Jim Harding, on the field, which is significant for these guys in learning the game and understanding their assignment. So I think, this group, again, it has the potential to be one of the best in the country. It's going to be up to them to play up to their ceiling, as often as possible. It's hard to expect that on a week in, week out basis, but I think, there are going to be games where this group just completely dominates and overwhelms the opponent and leads Utah to the victory. So I think this group is the next biggest X factor on the offensive side of the ball for Utah, is the offensive line. The number 3 X factor for me on the offensive side of the ball is Jason Beck's play calling. There's a lot of individuals that I probably could have singled out, especially at the skill positions, because Utah is going to need players to emerge at those spots. But I think Beck's play calling will be, a pretty significant X factor for Utah this season. Over the last 2 seasons, Utah just became way too predictable. And obviously there are a number of reasons for that. Obviously when you have a freshman quarterback, a true freshman quarterback, the playbook, the command of the playbook just isn't the same as a veteran. When you have to rely on, your backup quarterbacks in 2023 to lead the way. Even an experienced vet like Bryson Barnes, there's still just limitations there. And the play calling just became way too easy to figure out, whether it be, certain personnel groupings or specific formations. Big 12 defenses just had this offense figured out this past season. So I think, with a fresh set of eyes, a new voice, and a creative offensive mind under the headset, I think Beck is going to be, a pretty big X factor for Utah this season. There will be quite a big shift in terms of personnel usages, where you're going from 12 and 13 personnel with 2 and 3 tight ends on the field to now more, 11 personnel where you've got 3 wide receivers on the field at a time. There's going to be variance in different play calls, particularly in the run game. And I think that's going to be the biggest difference that Utah fans will notice is just how different the run game looks compared to what it's been under Ludwig. And I think Dampierre's presence has a big reason, will play a big reason in that as well. So I think with the quarterback that he's very familiar with and understanding his strengths and weaknesses, having spent the time with him last year, I think this is going to be a pretty big difference maker for Utah this season. Is Beck calling the plays on the offensive side of the ball? Move over to the defensive side of the ball. Um, I think the biggest X factor for Utah is actually going to be the linebackers on the defense side of the ball. Traditionally, when Utah, has the sort of linebacker play, high level linebacker play, that typically bodes pretty well for the defensive unit as a whole. Um, so, last year the linebacker room lost a couple key pieces. Obviously, Levani Devmooney in spring ball was lost for the season, and then Karenni Reed was lost in week 2 for a couple weeks, and that put a lot on the shoulders of Lander Barton, who was also making a return from a significant injury that he suffered in 2023. And you could see that Barton it was battling through the highs and lows. There were really promising moments. There were some struggles. There were a lot of missed tackles, and I think one thing that sort of um, shows Barton and the progress that he made in terms of, obviously, I think for 2/3 of the season last year, there were a lot of inconsistencies. There were struggles. There were ups and downs. But I think over the final month of the season, not only Lander Barton, but Jonathan Hall really settled in and started to play a bit more consistently and a bit more fundamentally sound. And so to illustrate that point, through the first 8 games of the season, Barton missed 13 tackles. That's the number that he was credited with according to Pro Football Focus. So 13 missed tackles over 8 games. Over the final 4 games, Barton limited that number to just 3. So I think that Houston game was really kind of the turning point for him. I think given what transpired in that game and a couple games before, I think for whatever was said, whatever sort of switch was flipped, he just got going in the final month of the season. And I think for him and for Utah, if he can continue to build on that momentum, which it seemed like he did during spring ball, he seemed a bit more lively, a bit more athletic. He seemed to just have that sort of mindset that he needed to be the sort of playmaker that a lot of Utah fans believe he can be. So, he limited the number of missed tackles to 3. He also, made plays. He had a couple interceptions, one return for touchdown over the final month of the season. He had a sack, a forced fumble. He was just, he limited the mistakes and he made plays over the final month of the season. So you want to see that continue. And then with John O'Hall, right, I think it's important to remember that he made this switch to linebacker after fall camp. He didn't even get fall camp last year to get work at the position he would end up playing last season. So for him, this was a big learning process. And you could see that, you could see the moments, that Utah State game, he had a great game, had a couple stops, at or behind the line of scrimmage. You could see the athleticism and how effective he was in knifing through the offensive line at times. But there were also, again, similar struggles that Barton had with missed tackles and struggles in coverage and that sort of thing. So for him, he acknowledged that, yeah, it was a bit of swimming in deep water. And he mentioned the Iowa State game as sort of the game where it all clicked for him. So, for me, I think the linebackers are going to be the biggest X factor because we've seen the difference on defense in terms of the impact that they have on this Utah defense as a whole when they're playing consistently, they're playing fundamentally sound, compared to when there's those missed tackles, those missed opportunities, and so I think as long as these two continue on the upward trend that they showed over the final month of the season, Utah's going to be in good shape with Lander and Jono, leading the way at that linebacker spot. You're also getting Levani Damuni back, and then you've just have so much depth at that position with Trey Reynolds and Kenai Lopes, and then the freshman that came in early as well. So to me, the linebackers are the biggest X factor on the defensive side of the ball. Um, for me, the second biggest X factor on the defense side of the ball. There's a number of individuals that I could have chosen, even in the secondary alone. But for me, I think the biggest in the secondary is Rabbit Evans. I think he has, he's sort of the type where, we're talking about the offensive line, we're talking about Lander Barton. Those are proven commodities, guys that you count on to play a certain level of football each and every week, who also have the potential to really, you know, play at a really elite level. With Evans, this is more of an unknown commodity where if he plays like he showed that he could play like in spring ball, that's a significant difference for this Utah defense. Um, there were flashes throughout spring ball that he could be, sort of a dynamic playmaker, where he could make plays in coverage. He could attack the line of scrimmage and make tackles behind the line of scrimmage for stops. He could blitz, get into the backfield, get after the quarterback. He looks sound in coverage. He wasn't dominant by any stretch of the means, but by any stretch of the imagination. But you saw the flashes. You saw enough flashes where you felt like, okay, it looks like Utah's got something here. And so if he continues to play with that sort of disruptive nature and the sort of playmaking that he showcased over the course of spring, you really like what that does for the defensive secondary, which already has an emerging star in Smith Snowden, has one of the top safeties in Teo Johnson. If Utah gets a dynamic playmaker at that strong safety position with Rabbit Evans, I think that's a really, really positive development for not only the secondary, but the defensive unit as a whole. So I think for me, Rabbit Evans is the second biggest X factor on the defense side of the ball. And then number three, the freshman defensive tackles. This is going to be interesting. So with Utah, you've got a couple of veterans, a few veterans coming back: Aliki Vomahi, Dallas Vakalahi, and Jonah Lea'ea. You've also got a walk-on turned scholarship player in Mike Tautioli. Those four are, they've been in the program a few years. You're expecting Dallas Vakalahi to take control of that defensive tackle room and be a consistent presence, a consistent positive force along the defensive line. You're going to count on Aliki Vamahi to be the veteran in the room, and to set the tone each and every week, each and every day. And then you've got others, Lea'ea, Tautioli, but there are going to be 5 freshman defensive tackles in the program this fall. And you're going to need 2, maybe 3 of them to emerge as potential rotational pieces. And when you look at the makeup of this group, you've got Carson Kafusi and Sione Motuapuaka. Let me get that right. You've got those two who enrolled early and went through spring ball and, have the familiarity of working under Luther Ellis. Then you brought in Dylan Bartle from the transfer portal. He enrolled early. He's a 2025 freshman. He enrolled early at LSU. So even though he didn't get to work at Utah, he still spent time, he still spent this offseason with a highly competitive program, received good coaching. So you kind of expect him to come in and sort of hit the ground running, similar to Carson Kafusi and Sione Motuapuaka. You think that I believe that Dylan Bartle is going to be, pretty prominent figure among that group. And then you're also welcoming Semi Taulunga out of Mater Dei and Pupu Sepulona out of St. Louis High School in Hawaii. And talking to a lot of folks, there was a lot of excitement about Taulunga and Sepulona and sort of the disruptive athleticism that they have along the defensive line. I think it'll be interesting to see what sort of element they can add to this room. Are they ready to compete right away? I think Taulonga is probably the more likely of Sepulona. Is the more likely candidate of the two coming in the summer to emerge as a potential rotational player this season, playing at Mater Day, competing against, great competition on a weekly basis, competing against, high level offensive linemen in practice each and every day. I think that's going to bode well. With Sepulona, he's a multi sport athlete, a really good, athlete. Where he's got the quickness, he's got the movement skills that you love. He's got a big body, at 6'2", 6'3", 260 pounds. Where's he going to be at in terms of his weight? We'll see. But I think you're looking at, when projecting forward to 2025, you need two or three of these guys to emerge as rotational players. And I think the short list for me is going to be, Carson Kafusi, who I've maintained, since he signed with Utah back in December, as a guy that'll figure into this rotation. I think Dylan Battle is going to figure into this rotation. Again, you love his size at 6'2", 313 pounds. And then I think Semi Taulunga is also going to be, another guy that figures his way into the rotation as well. So for me, this is a group, these freshmen, they're a bit of an X factor in terms of being an unknown quantity, coming in and potentially earning rotational, snaps. I think that, depending on their level of play, they can potentially make a nice difference for Utah in this defensive tackle room. You don't want to rely on true freshmen, particularly in the trenches, but I think Utah set up well where you've got some veterans in place to, play the majority of the minutes, and then getting, some of these freshmen into the rotation and working them, periodically throughout games and throughout the season, I think will benefit this unit, not only this season, but long term beyond the season as well. So that to me is the third biggest defensive X factor. And then overall, I mean, how can you not talk about health and the injury bug? This has been the biggest issue for Utah the past two seasons. I've kept tabs on the number of games lost to injury over the last two seasons. Utah lost over 60 games to injury from players on the two deep just last season. And then the year before that, with all of the, season ending injuries that Utah had, that number was well over 100 in terms of players that started the year on the two deep. And obviously there's some debate about whether Cam Rising was genuinely, on that two deep or not to start the season. He was. But yeah, Utah's lost over 150 games to injury the past two seasons. So you're looking for injury luck to swing back in your favor. And if spring ball is any indication, they avoided any sort of significant injury. And so we're going to knock on wood, and we're going to continue to knock on wood through the end of the podcast with this. Utah needs the injury luck. They need the injury fortune. And, Whittingham has talked about their constantly reviewing and assessing some of the data, some of the science, and making tweaks and making adjustments as they need to. And I think spring ball is a good indication that maybe they have made the necessary tweaks to avoid significant injury. But obviously fall camp looms large, and we'll see with UCLA being game one. Utah's going to have to ramp up pretty quickly. So how do you preserve health? How do you prepare for a power conference foe at the same time? We'll see. But, health is going to be the biggest X factor for Utah, given what they've experienced the last two seasons and what they need this year. They need health. They need the injury fortune. So that's my list. I've got 7 X factors for Utah this season. Health being the biggest X factor overall, and I think all of you would agree with that. And then offensively, Devin Dampier, the offensive line playing up to their ceiling. Jason Beck's play calling. Defensively, I've got the linebackers, Rabbit Evans, and the freshman defensive tackles as the biggest X factors for Utah heading into 2025. So, as always, would be curious to hear from you guys. Hit me with your X factors. Who do you think is going to emerge? Whether it be individuals, whether it be position groups, who or what do you think are the biggest X factors for Utah going into 2025? I'm going to wrap this one up. I'll be back later this week. I think I'm going to get Blair Angulo of 24/7 Sports to join me on Friday. So looking forward to that. A nice conversation about Utah recruiting, and we'll go from there. But appreciate all you listeners, and appreciate the Utah Blockcast supporters. And we'll be back on Friday.